Okay, in this video we'll talk about speciation. One of the first questions we need to ask is, well, what is a species, and how does one species become two species? Okay, so those are some guiding questions to keep in mind. You should have some guided notes out and ready to fill them in. Alright, so in class we did watch an intro video. This is on Deep Look, a series called Deep Look about Ensatina salamanders. So if you haven't seen that already, that'd be a good thing to look up on YouTube. And it tells the story of this salamander species that is featured in your workbook. Okay, pages 35 through 37 of your workbook have that same story. Go ahead and read through that as well. In class we discussed whether these salamanders had split or not. I was actually out for some of this section, so this was the planned activity, but this is what we had to do. So this is the Deep Look video. If you look it up under PBS, or Ensatina salamanders are heading for a family split. We're not going to watch it here, but that is a really good explanation or a good case study of some speciation that may have occurred. Okay, and briefly, see if I can kind of explain using the cursor here. We had a whole population, one population of salamanders start north of the Central Valley in California, and they started to migrate. Maybe they needed more space or food or resources, and so some of them went north and some of them went south, and the ones that went south ended up going around the Central Valley. Okay, this is a desert in California, and if you can imagine, salamanders are kind of slippery and moist. Their skin really requires, they're amphibians, so they need a lot of moisture in their skin. So they would not be able to survive trekking across the desert like this. So this is effectively basically splitting up the population in two. So this side went down this way and this side went down this way. And once they got around the Central Valley, which took generations and generations of time, they ended up meeting up down here. And this allowed scientists to determine whether they had actually become two different species over time, or if they were the same species. Okay, so this is the example that we've used in class. And the workbook features the Ensatina escholtzii, I'm probably saying that wrong, and cloudberry. So these are the two of the subspecies in the Ensatina species. Okay, so we use OINK, or O-I-N-K, as a way to think through speciation. Okay, so in this story, the salamanders began as one species. Okay, they started here and they were one population. Two halves of the population became isolated from one another. Okay, because of the Central Valley, they migrated around this. This means that there is no gene flow. The genes are not flowing between the two halves of the population because they cannot reproduce. Right? If you are not in the same physical location, you are unable to reproduce. And on either side of the Central Valley, natural selection happened, as it does over generations of time. Different selective pressures may have been present on this side of the desert versus this side. As you can imagine, this one's right up against the ocean. This one's on the other side of the desert. So different forces acting on the population. And when they met up, the question was, can they have kids? Right? To be the same species, you have to be able to reproduce, and you have to be able to make viable offspring. Offspring are kids, right? If your kids cannot have kids, if your babies are unable to have babies, then you are considered to be two different species. Okay? If you're the same species, you should be able to mate and make viable offspring. Okay? So OINK, one species, isolated, natural selection, and kids. OINK leads us through the process of speciation. Okay. Now what the scientists found in terms of the whole kids question was that one of the subspecies, so Escholzii, females were kind of picky. They rejected the cloudberry males, and they did not really want to mate with them. So we kind of see some breaking down of this reproduction part of the equation. The females, the cloudberry females, were not picky, so they would mate with anyone. And then their offspring, the hybrids between these two subspecies, were poorly camouflaged, so they're not going to survive very well. And they were not good at mimicry. They were not able to produce this red color that was very effective against certain predators that avoided red coloration, because the California newt is a red species that is actually poisonous. So when the salamanders kind of pretended to be a California newt, they would help improve their survival chances, right? And also these hybrids had difficulty finding mates. So the mating was not guaranteed, and their offspring were not entirely viable. Okay? If they can't really survive very well and they have difficulty finding mates, then they might not be able to reproduce very well. But they're kind of able to. So what we're seeing here is that essentially we're kind of seeing the midway through the speciation process snapshot, right? So they haven't quite split yet, but they're definitely on their way. Okay? So another example that we could think about that's a little more familiar to us is dogs, right? All of these are the same species, Canis. They're all the same. They're all dogs, but they're different breeds. Okay, so like this breed would be different from this one and this one, kind of like the Cloudberry and Escholzii, and Oregonensis, and the other ones that came up there. Okay, same idea, same criteria. What are the criteria for being the same species? Well, organisms of the same species can mate and produce viable offspring. Okay, if you're viable, it means that you're not sterile, or otherwise you can reproduce. Okay, so speciation has occurred when these two are no longer possible. Okay, you are no longer the same species if you cannot mate, and you can also not produce. You also can't produce viable offspring. So how would this process happen? Same as it happened in the salamanders. You begin as one species, and you have some event that isolates you. Let's say we start off with these two breeds. Okay, kind of cute little. I don't know what breeds these are. I'm not very good. This one looks like a hyena almost. I think this is some kind of Chinese. I don't know. I'm going to embarrass myself. And then this one looks like a teddy bear. So there's my knowledge of dogs. They both look like they're fairly small, so maybe at this point, you know, they would be able to make babies together. They could reproduce. But if they were isolated, if they were put on two separate islands, for example, and natural selection happened within this population and within this population, they would be experiencing different selective pressures, and if they were to be put together again, the question would be, can they have kids, right? If speciation were to occur, this would mean that they can no longer have kids, even when they were placed together. Okay, so this is another example. I'm guessing your notes brings this up. The oink explained is okay, so we have O, beginning as one species, I, isolation event. Okay, we have to be physically separated in order to restrict the gene flow. Okay, the genes are going to flow through reproduction. If you have a physical barrier, then that will serve as an isolation event. Natural selection occurs within each population. The selected traits will depend on the selective pressures faced by each. Okay, the more different the selective pressures are, the natural selection is going to. If you have really different traits, let me say this again. If you have very different selective pressures, like one experiences cold and one experiences a lot of predation, you're going to have very different traits develop fairly rapidly. Okay, and then again, the K is cannot mate or produce viable offspring. Okay, this is the kids question. Mating behaviors, attraction, and timing may have diverged too far. They may have gotten too different during natural selection. Okay, so let's just imagine that that happens to these two subspecies. You might end up with something like this. Okay, if this one underwent the selective pressure of predation, they would probably become more aggressive. I am totally making this up. This is a little bit extreme, but it could happen, right? The ones that are going to be a little more aggressive and, I don't know, predatory are going to survive and reproduce better. Over here, natural selection is going to dictate that if the selective pressure is cold, the one that produces a lot of fur is going to win out. So could this work? Could basically a hyena-looking organism mate with the mop dog? I'm going to say maybe not. There would probably be a lot of barriers there. Okay, so that would be an example of how speciation might occur in dogs. All right, one last example, and just some factors that influence the rate of speciation. The initial population size. If it's a big population size, it's going to probably go through speciation a little slower, okay, because there's going to be a lot of gene flow within each side of the population. But if it's small, then speciation might occur very quickly. Okay, the strength of selective pressure, right? If we have two different, very different selective pressures acting on the two sides of the population, this could also speed up speciation. How many generations do we go through in how many days, right? With fruit flies or some of these insects, it's really just several days or weeks that a new generation is born. And every time a new generation is born, that gives us possibility of a mutation happening and new traits developing. Okay? So that's the story of speciation. Make sure that you remember how to apply OINC to that story and be able to explain a new case study using those words, using that acronym.